Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about local and global ecosystems and of course the human impact on the global and local ecosystems. So it's important to note the distribution of local and global ecosystems change over time. And you should also know eventually how to predict consequences of human actions on both local and global ecosystems. So let's talk about what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is an ecological community plus the abiotic environment with which it exchanges energy and materials. Ecosystems are linked by exchanges of organisms and materials over large spatial scales. So it's impossible to understand a local ecosystem completely without considering it in the context of larger systems of which it is part. So, of course, ecosystems are going to function through dynamic processes, and ecosystem components are going to exchange and transform energy and materials. But ultimately, movement of materials between abiotic and biotic components are tied to carbon. And one measure of this is, of course, our net primary productivity, which we did practice problems with in class. And it's a measure of flow of materials and energy into the biotic component. And there's different ways to calculate this and measure this, but NPP is going to vary among ecosystem types, mostly due to variation in climate and nutrient availability. So, for example, tropical forests, swamps, marshes, and coral reefs are going to be the most productive type of ecosystems, and cultivated land, like we see over here, is going to be less productive than many natural ecosystems. Here's just another look at that of how our NPP is going to vary among different types of ecosystems. And we notice that our numbers are much greater in our tropical forests here, our freshwater swamps and marshes, and our desert scrub is going to have a very low NPP. Okay, also, our NPP is going to vary with latitude. The tropics are very productive, and high latitudes are less productive. So generally, we're going to have a general increase in activity as we have an increase in temperature until we get to an optimal rate. And then once we get to this point of denaturation of proteins, the activity of our photosynthetic enzymes is going to decrease once we reach that point where they will denature. So this pattern parallels latitudinal gradients in solar energy input and temperature, showing that net primary productivity increases with temperature, just like our photosynthetic enzymes are going to increase with temperature, but up into the point that they denature. Okay, moisture is another factor that's going to increase our NPP. At very high moisture levels, productivity may be inhibited by cloud cover or lack of oxygen in saturated soils, but generally deserts and dry regions have low NPP. And generally, an increase in moisture is going to increase NPP until we get to that very high moisture level. Okay, it's important to note that all the materials in the bodies of living organisms are ultimately derived from abiotic sources, and we've watched videos already and looked at resources about our biogeochemical cycles. But primary producers take up elements from inorganic pools and accumulate them as biomass, and then trophic interactions pass the elements on to heterotrophs. And so generally we're going to consume our autotrophs, and we'll get all of these materials that we can use within our own cells and bodies. Very quickly, we're going to glance at the water cycle, which you're familiar with, but I want to talk about ways that humans can affect the water cycle. One way is removing vegetation, pumping, which depletes groundwater, and of course, climate warming. So in removing vegetation, we have deforestation, we have removing vegetation for crop purposes, but what this is going to do is reduce precipitation retained in soil and going to increase the amount of runoff. What pumping does is deplete groundwater, bringing it to the surface where it evaporates. And climate warming is going to where we have the melting of our ice caps and our glaciers, increasing sea levels and evaporation, and then water vapor, of course, is a greenhouse gas, which we'll talk about as well. Okay, briefly, we're going to talk about the human impact on the nitrogen cycle. So, certain things that humans do that affect the nitrogen cycle include burning fossil fuels, rice cultivation, raising livestock that releases oxides, and these oxides, of course, are going to contribute to smog and acid rain, and our nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. So, humans fix nitrogen by an industrial process to manufacture fertilizer and explosives. Quickly looking at our carbon cycle. Oops. Okay, so here are human activities that affect the global carbon cycle. Basically, any activity that impacts primary productivity can alter these fluxes in our carbon cycle. We have activity that is going to affect runoff, is going to bring carbon to aquatic ecosystems, and that overload of carbon has a lot of detrimental effects sometimes. And deforestation, biomass burning, fossil fuel burning can also increase atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So any burning of fossil fuels is going to affect our carbon cycle. So all of these biogeochemical cycles are interconnected, and the fluxes of materials are going to be linked if they share a common or physical or biological process. So carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, they all have water-soluble forms that can be transported together in runoff. So we want to make sure we pay attention to the ways in which humans are going to impact each of these cycles. Let's talk briefly about the greenhouse effect. I'm sure you've heard of this before, but Earth's surface re-emits energy in longer, less energetic infrared wavelengths, and then some of this infrared radiation is absorbed by greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere, and those molecules are warmed and radiate these infrared photons back to the Earth's surface, keeping the energy within the lower atmosphere instead of having it radiate away. So greenhouse gases are overall going to increase the global Earth temperature. Okay, so some of these greenhouse gases are going to include water vapor, of course, carbon dioxide, methane, which is our CH4, and nitrous oxide, which is our N2O here. And of course, our global greenhouse gases have increased dramatically over time. Here's another graph looking at similar levels. We see a huge spike. If we look at a longer term view, of course, after Industrial Revolution, we have a huge increase in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. This is commonly what we call the hockey stick graph. This is the average annual global temperatures that have been increasing dramatically, of course, as we have increased certain types of human activities. Okay. So why is this bad and why do we want to talk about it? A warmer Earth can mean hotter air temperatures, a more intense water cycle with greater overall evaporation precipitation. Warming can also increase storm intensity and weather variability. And so strong hurricanes, we've seen a lot more of those, like Hurricane Sandy from 2012, which devastated so many people, and it was an extremely large disaster. These have just become more frequent since the 1970s when we start to see that spike in our hockey stick graph. Okay, human effects on biogeochemical cycles also are going to affect Earth's radiation balance by adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which we've talked about. And so activities include fossil fuel burning, cement manufacture, forest clearing, expanded livestock production, water impoundment, wetland, crop cultivation, all of these things. So as you know, human impact accelerates change at local and global levels. So we've seen a variety of examples of that already. We're going to talk about a few more. One example is going to be logging. Now, logging is a process. We cut down trees. We take them for production of whatever purpose. But we've seen things like increased flooding. Really significant major floods have occurred linked directly to excessive logging, and that's led to hundreds of deaths in places like the Philippines and Thailand. So this can be very dangerous, not only for the environment, but for human lives directly. So other effects of logging include deforestation, of course, which obviously includes habitat loss, which can lead to a loss of biodiversity. Generally, the number one reason for loss of biodiversity is going to be connected to habitat loss in an environment. We'll see, again, rapid erosion, flooding, weathering, humus decomposition. This is like the nutrient composition within the soil. We're not going to see as much of that because there's fewer trees. And of course, increased wildfires as well. And that one I thought was interesting because there are a lot of different instances where we're going to see the wildfires are actually increased by the lack of foliage and related changes in the way that the vegetation is standing, and we're going to see more horizontal vertical air movements caused by fires, and that can produce significant and lasting effects on, of course, a regional climate. Let's talk briefly about urbanization. Now, over half the world's population currently live in cities. Some predict it's going to be up to 70% by 2050. And urbanization is just a general part of development of any nation, but there can be some really negative effects of urbanization as well. So a lot of papers state that unsustainable urbanization is going to have disastrous effects on global ecosystems, especially in areas of Asia, Africa, South America that are rapidly growing and that are going to overlap with biodiversity hotspots. So urban expansion is going to lead to the demise of predicted amphibian species, mammalian species, bird species that are critically endangered or or threatened at the moment. So, of course, we're talking about biodiversity loss, water and air quality can go down, there's a strain on natural resources, and we also have what are called urban heat islands, and these are a metropolitan area that is significantly warmer than the rural areas surrounding it because of human activities. We have surfaces of pavements and roofs that reaching high temperatures, and at night we're going to see a huge difference in general temperatures. On the other hand, suburban sprawl is also going to have huge effects on local environments. Studies estimate that if you live in a suburban area, you're going to spend 31% of your time more you're going to drive 31% more, than your urban counterpart. You're going to have generally more energy use because you're taking up more space in the home, you consume more, you have more space per individual, not only space within an apartment versus a house, but space in land. You're going to take up more land in general per person, and of course there will be generally more resource consumption in a suburban area. So generally, people think that the way that suburban lifestyle is going currently, people estimate it's very unsustainable. We're going to see increased greenhouse gas production, and of course, lots of reducing of open available space for people who live in a suburban environment. Okay, so really quickly, we're going to wrap it up and talk about how introduction of new diseases can also devastate native species. We can see examples of this with the Dutch elm disease, potato blight, and of course the introduction of smallpox to the Native American population, which is a good, not good, but terrible historical example because it's devastating. But we're going to talk very briefly about the fungus that caused the Dutch elm disease. It was an epidemic in the mid-1900s in U.S. and Europe. Elms did not have a resistance in the U.S. and Europe to this particular fungus. It's transported spread by beetles, which are the vector, but Asian elms did, and so people hypothesized that there was a furniture company that purchased wood that had these beetles inside of it, and they brought the disease to the United States in the mid-1900s. And within a few decades, and elm trees were dying by the hundreds of thousands in the U.S., and there was catastrophic losses within cities and different areas within the U.S. And so just because humans brought in a few new species to a certain area, we had these elms nearly truly devastated and nearly wiped out until there was removal crews and a huge fight against the Dutch elm epidemic. All right, so that's it for right now. We're going to be talking more about human impact later. Thank you guys for watching.